Okay, let's open up our page to page 440. Open up our book to page 442. Lesson 3, Industrialization, Immigration, and the Progressive Era. Let's look at the key ideals. The U.S. underwent rapid industrialization starting in the mid-1800s. Immigrants came from many places to work in the expanding American industries. Rapid industrialization brought problems which labor unions and reformers tried to solve, especially during the Progressive Era. Let's look at the top of page 442, and let's begin. In the mid-1800s, American industries, which had been growing steadily since the late 1700s, began a period of extremely fast growth. This rapid industrialization occurred for several interconnected reasons. With the addition of the vast western territories, the United States gained plentiful natural resources. Among these resources were materials, such as metals needed to manufacture new products and machines, and fuels, such as coal, needed to run these machines. Another reason for rapid industrialization was the invention of many new machines and new industrial processes. With these new inventions and processes, manufactured goods could be produced more easily, more efficiently, and less expensively. A third reason for the rapid industrialization was the nation's booming population. The U.S. population more than doubled in the last 40 years of the 1800s. There were more people to buy more goods, spurring commerce and further industrial growth. Let's move up the slides and show these illustrations that we have. Here's some additional information about the Industrial Revolution. Okay, let's move the slide up a bit. And let's move the slide up. So we're going to show this video about the Industrial Revolution.
Industrial Revolution, 18th to 19th century. The economic developments of the 1800s saw the development of agrarian and handicraft economies in Europe and America transform into industrial urbanized ones. The term to describe this phenomenon would be known as the Industrial Revolution, and was first used by French writers, but made popular by English economic historian Arnold Toynbee. The Industrial Revolution was underpinned by the Agricultural Revolution. From the mid-18th century to the mid-19th century, agricultural production increased significantly. The huge increase in food output supported the expansion and sustained a large population and boosted trade. The increased use of machines over human or animal power in farming also meant that less farm workers were needed, and they could leave the land to industrial towns. Better metals and richer fuel also contributed to industrialization by creating the steam engine, an integral machine to industrialization which powered factories, locomotives, and ships. The new steam engines used coal and iron, both in their construction and as fuel, increasing demand for these resources. Roads, canals, and railways changed Britain dramatically, connecting Britain and allowing goods to be sent over long distances. Visually, the revolution was clear in the new industrial towns, with smoking factories dominating the skyline. The cities were horrible to live in, overcrowded and dirty, with dangerous conditions in the factories and strict rules and punishments. The Industrial Revolution saw mechanization in factories of the textile industry, which was previously manufactured in the home, creating the term cottage industry. Now, production could be increased on a large scale because of new inventions such as the spinning mule and the power loom. The iron industry developed with Henry Bessemer's inexpensive process for mass-producing steel. Iron and steel were key materials for constructing the tools and machinery, steam engines, and ships needed for the industrial progress. industrial labour opportunities drew people to the cities from the countryside, to such an extent that in 1750 only 15% of the population of Britain lived in towns. By 1850, over 50% of the entire population of Great Britain lived in either a town or a city, and by 1900 it was 85%. London had 4.5 million people, Glasgow 760,000, Liverpool 685,000, and Manchester and Birmingham 500,000. Great Britain was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and was the only mature industrial economy for a long time. Historians have speculated that this was because, as an island, there was relative peace and stability for Britain compared to mainland Europe. Rather than spending on a large defensive standing army, capital could be spent on other ventures, and there was confidence for investors. Native resources were also abundant and readily available for initial technological developments and inventions. Engineers and inventors were also respected and encouraged in British society, and were backed by wealthy patrons. A powerful navy and an empire bringing in vast wealth from its colonies also contributed to the catalyst for industrialization before others. Nevertheless, Germany, France, Switzerland, Belgium, and the United States soon emulated Britain's industrial change, and by 1900, Britain would no longer be at the top, with the United States as the world's leading industrial nation in the 20th century.
Subscribe for more history videos.
Okay, let's go ahead and move the slide up, and then we'll cover the information in the book along with the slide. So let's move that slide up. We're going to talk a little bit about the mentioning of the addition of the Western territories. So remember in the first paragraph where they mentioned the rapid industrialization, and it said with the addition of the vast Western territories, the United States gained plenty of natural resource. And you can see this area here that was that addition of Western territories, all that new area there. And let's move the slide up a little bit. Because keep in mind, remember the U.S. began along the eastern coastline, and all the new area along the westward side of the country gained a lot of new natural resources. Okay, let's move up to the next slide. So here's a video to illustrate those new western regions.
Making tracks. In the 1850s, the fastest way to travel over land was by train. But at the time, railroad lines didn't extend all the way across the United States. Pioneers trying to reach the West had to survive a difficult journey by wagon that could take 6 months. To unite the country by rail, President Abraham Lincoln granted 2 companies the opportunity of a lifetime to build the first transcontinental railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad would start from Nebraska and the Central Pacific from California. The 2 lines would eventually meet in the middle. The companies were promised huge plots of land and thousands of dollars for each mile of track they laid. The race was on to make a fortune. Starting in Sacramento, California, the Central Pacific Railroad faced an enormous hurdle. Its track had to pass through the towering Sierra Nevada mountain range. The mountains posed a great challenge for engineers. But it wasn't the engineers who were laying the track. Laborers from Ireland and China did most of the hard work for low pay. They faced harsh conditions, blasting through mountains and tunneling through rocky terrain. In the East, The Union Pacific Railroad workers were rushing ahead on the flat plains, but their path was intruding on other people's land. This was home to the Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, and many other American Indian tribes. To conquer the western frontier, the United States government forced American Indians off their land, and the buffalo that Native Americans depended on for food, clothing, and shelter were being hunted to extinction by the newcomers. For Native Americans, the railroad didn't represent progress. It meant the destruction of their way of life. Many tried to halt the railroad's construction, but their resistance couldn't stop America's westward expansion. The push was on. The meeting point for the two railroads was set in Promontory Summit, Utah. As the railroads drew closer, laborers were pushed to work faster. Even more money was now being awarded for each mile of completed track. Setting a historic record, Chinese workers laid 10 miles of track in a single day. It was their speed that propelled the Central Pacific to reach the finish line first. On May 10, 1869, the final golden spike was hammered into the track, completing the world's first transcontinental railroad. A journey across the country that had taken 6 months by wagon could now be made in 7 days. And along the route, thousands of acres of land were open to settlers who would forever change the American West.
Okay, we're going to move the slide up, please, and then we'll discuss the next paragraph in the book. Let's look at the next paragraph. Rapid industrialization meant that many new factories were built in the mid and late 1800s. Most were built in or near the nation's large cities, including New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. These urban centers had large groups of people who could work in the factories, and large groups of people who would buy the goods the factories produce. Look at the illustration here, and you can see some of the industrial machines and processes that were used in the early 1800s. Okay, let's look at the next paragraph in your book. U.S. factory jobs drew many immigrants to American cities. Although the United States has always been a nation of immigrants, the late 1800s saw a sharp rise in the number of people moving here from foreign countries. The majority came from Europe, including Germany, Italy, Russia, and Eastern European countries. Many also came from Mexico and Central America. Asian immigration was declining because the government had passed laws barring Chinese from moving to the United States. However, thousands of Japanese came to this country, taking jobs in farm fields and mines. Let's move the slides up. So here you can see what the U.S. population was like in terms of its growth during this period. And let's move the slide up. And let's move the slide up. And we have a video that illustrates what was going on in terms of the growth of the population during this time. Let's play the video. Let's move the slide up. Here's an illustration of the immigration to the U.S. in the 1800s. And let's move the slide up. Another slide showing the flow of immigrants into the United States. Move the slide up, and a video illustrating U.S. immigration in the 1800s. Let's play the video.
After more than 4 decades of relatively little immigration into America after its founding, in the 1830s, tens of thousands of immigrants began arriving on her eastern shores, again mainly from Britain, Ireland, and Germany. Some were attracted to the cheap farmland that was made available by westward expansion, while others took advantage of the manufacturing boom in the cities sparked by the Industrial Revolution. The Irish were mainly unskilled laborers who built most of the railroads and canals, took jobs in the emerging textile mill towns in the Northeast, or worked in the ports. About half of the Germans became farmers, mainly in the Midwest, and the other half became craftsmen in urban areas. Asian immigrants, mainly from China, began crossing the Pacific to work as laborers, particularly on the Transcontinental Railroad or in the mines.
Immigration also during the 19th century was usually male-dominated, males in their prime working years between the years of 18 to 25. The Irish being the one exception. Eventually there would be more Irish women who immigrated than Irish men. Immigrants to this day often follow established patterns. They leave one village or one city and go to another city in the United States because someone has already established that pattern for them. People go to where they know people. And those people here often can arrange for jobs and employment and places to live and so on. It was often said that your first job when you got off the boat was whoever picked you up at the docks. Now people say your first job is whoever picks you up at the airport.
After tripling from the decade before, in just 2 more decades, from the 1830s to the 1850s, the amount of immigrants arriving in the United States each year tripled again to about 170,000. By the 1850s, when the total population of the country passed 20 million and things began to get a bit crowded, America's first measurable anti-immigrant feelings began to take root, mainly targeting Irish Catholic immigrants who were arriving in large numbers to escape the poverty and death of the potato famine that was hitting them hard at home. But with the huge boom on the horizon, this early xenophobia was nothing compared to what would come later. Thanks for watching part 3 of our 6-part series on America's history of immigration. Click on the screen to go back and start watching part 1, or the next video, part 4, or our newest video.
Okay, let's look back at the next paragraph in the book. And please follow along in your book. America's factory workers, whether native or foreign-born, work very hard at grueling, dangerous work. Many receive low pay for long hours on the job. Over time, workers began to unionize. By joining a union, workers pledged to work together for better and safer working conditions and higher wages. They called strikes when their employers cut their pay or refused to grant raises. Many of the laws we have today, including the 8-hour workday and the 5-day work week, came about through the bitter struggles for better working conditions that unions waged in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Let's look at some slides that illustrate those points. So let's scroll up. Here's some additional information about labor unions that illustrate the points we just discussed in your text. Okay, let's move it up. And let's move the slide up. So we're going to play a video about the labor union movement. And let's begin.
To most of us, Labor Day means time off from work, maybe a barbecue to mark the official end of summer. But how much do you know about what inspired its creation? The labor movement. The labor movement started around the Industrial Revolution, a time in the late 19th century when America exploded in size and wealth. Advances in technology created manufacturing jobs, and people moved to cities to work in factories. But it wasn't the workers getting rich. It was their bosses who raked in big profits by paying low wages for long hours. Fed up with big business, industrial workers created unions to fight for better conditions. Unions are the backbone of the labor movement. But what exactly did they accomplish? Well, for one, you can thank the labor movement for your work-free weekend. In the late 1800s, the average American worked as much as 100 hours a week. Unions held strikes to demand shorter work weeks and an 8-hour workday to make time for family and relaxation. The most famous strike, the Haymarket Riots, happened in Chicago on May 1st, 1886, with thousands of people taking to the streets, and their voices only grew louder from there. The labor movement also protested child labor. Remember those black and white photos of children with dirty, sad faces wearing overalls and beanie caps? Those kids weren't playing outside, but they were working in factories. In 1881, unions demanded that businesses stop hiring kids under 14. And slowly but surely, measures against child labor caught on around the country. Eventually, all those protests got results. In 1938, Congress passed a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the 40-hour work week, regulated child labor, and set standards for minimum wage and overtime pay. In the 1930s and 1940s, workers were also able to negotiate health benefit plans from their employers. Though union membership is on a decline today, it's undeniable that the labor movement forever changed the way Americans live, work, and even relax.
Young people in large numbers came out and joined.
Okay, let's move the slide up and we'll show you some illustrations of some of the things that were happening during the labor movement. For an example, the labor movement would cause strikes, and we have some illustrations. Let's move the slide up. And let's move it up a little bit more. And let's move it up to the next slide. We're going to talk about labor union strikes, and we'll present this video. Okay, labor union strikes, and what strikes are, and when and how they call them. Let's play the video.
In the early 1880s, labor conditions were pretty hard. A lot of new immigrants were coming to America. They were reasonably unskilled, but often quite cheap labor, and they were exploited for such. So that the typical work day could be 12 hours. They often worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. Child labor was not allowed, but it wasn't regulated, and so kids as young as 6, 7, 8, 10 worked in the mills, and the conditions were not terribly safe. There were terrible accidents that occurred. The first Labor Day was September 1882. The founder probably was Matthew McGuire. He helped to organize a major march and demonstration to affirm labor's rights. And 10,000 people marched. That was a Tuesday. It was the first Tuesday in September. What triggered a national Labor Day in 1894 was a rather dramatic strike that took place. The Pullman workers in Chicago went out on strike. The federal government intervened because the Pullman cars basically, with a boycott of them, stopped the American railway system from operating. So the federal troops were called out to crush the strike. People were killed. It was a terribly violent strike. It was not a happy day for labor. Government, being politicians, wanted labor on their side, and so as a concession, they then passed legislation authorizing a Labor Day, first Monday in September from then on. Labor Day has evolved since 1894. Increasingly, even the marches and the parades became really opportunities for a patriotic holiday more than actually a celebration of labor per se.
But the union makes us strong.
We have paid holidays because of the labor movement. We have an 8-hour day because of the labor movement. We have paid vacations because of the labor movement. We have health care, those of us who still have it, because of the labor movement. And it's a chance really to recognize those kinds of gains. But over time, it's become much more than that. It has become, for all of us, the marker of the end of summer, the beginning of school, an opportunity for picnics, for barbecues. In its own way, ironically, Labor Day is as much about consumption as it is about labor nowadays. I'd like to think that the problems facing labor and unemployment are on people's minds. I'm sure that they are on people's minds. I'm not sure that Labor Day is triggering those concerns anymore. And that's unfortunate.
Okay, let's look at the last paragraph in the book. Okay, at the bottom of page 442, we're going to finish up this last paragraph. Unions weren't the only groups working to solve problems brought on by America's rapid industrialization. Some reformers worked to clean up slums, improve health care, and stop child labor. Others worked to preserve the nation's natural beauty by creating national parks. Still others worked to give more people a voice in government. For example, many women lobbied to gain the right to vote. In the early 1900s, groups were working toward so many sweeping social and political improvements that the time is called the Progressive Era. Let's look at the slides. Okay, let's move this one up. Here's an example of what the Progressive Era was all about. Okay, let's slide it up a little bit. And let's move that up. So we're going to show you a video about the Progressive Era and social reform.
In the late 1800s, the United States experienced rapid industrial growth. Many people left rural areas or their homes in Europe to find work in the new factories in America's cities. Large corporations spread across the country. New schools and universities were established to educate the growing workforce. As people became more educated, the newspaper and publishing industries boomed. But this period of growth also included corruption and inequality. Big businesses often use their growing profits and power to destroy competitors and form monopolies in the railroad, steel, coal, and oil industries. Working conditions in mines and factories were harsh and dangerous. And as people flooded into the cities in search of work, the problems of crowded housing and poor sanitation increased. Corrupt city leaders called bosses often accepted bribes and gave contracts and jobs to their political allies. The reform movement of progressivism arose to combat the greed, corruption, and other problems that industrialization had created. Progressives, most of whom came from the middle class, wanted to improve the lives of the poor living in America's growing slums. They also condemned the abuses of corporate power and the corruption in city governments. Progressive writers wrote fictional stories and poetry that revealed the hardships faced by many people living in America's cities. Progressive journalists used biting articles and cartoons in newspapers and magazines to expose the corruption of city bosses and business leaders. These writers were called muckrakers because they dug into the dirty deeds of those they wished to expose. Progressives succeeded in creating a public outcry against government corruption. Teddy Roosevelt was America's first progressive president. Between 1901 and 1909, Roosevelt used his position to break up many trusts. These were huge combinations of companies that used their economic power to take advantage of their competitors and workers. Roosevelt's Square Deal was designed to give all Americans, from farmers to businessmen, an equal chance to succeed. Roosevelt created the Pure Food and Drug Act to protect consumers, and he established the National Park System to conserve the environment. Progressives also hoped to win the right for women to vote. Suffragettes, or female activists, had been fighting for the vote since the 1840s. By the early 1900s, support for women's suffrage had grown as more women took jobs and became better educated. Finally, under President Woodrow Wilson, reformers convinced Congress to pass the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. When enough states ratified it, the amendment passed. Now women were guaranteed the right to vote. Despite these improvements, many people felt left behind. America's minority populations and new immigrants continued to face deep prejudices, segregation, and violence. While progressive activists succeeded in reducing corruption, improved worker and food safety, and increased the rights of women, widespread racial injustice and anti-immigrant sentiment remained part of American society. What methods?
Okay, this will end our presentation for lesson 3 on page 442. We'll stop here.